Today we're going to talk all about the future of money, and this was a session that was part of the Innotribe program earlier today. We have a host of guests to talk about this. Gosh, aren't we lucky? Let me introduce you to all of them. The closest to me is Scott Bales, serial entrepreneur, Movin, user strategy, Next Bank, Touch Media Networks. That's a lot of titles you got. Then Hank Uberoy is the CEO of Earthport. Also with us is Patrick Merck, General Counsel of Bitcoin Foundation. Chris Skinner is the chairman of the Financial Services Club. And if we go to the back row, Udayan Goyal is also with us, partner and co-founder of Anthemis Group. And last but not least, Dave Gray, the author of The Connected Company. So am I right in thinking all of you were at the Innotribe program, you were all speakers at that session?
Uday and I did the opening. We set the context of the session. We've both been involved with Innotribe since it started in 2009. And each year we've looked at the future of money. So we've looked at alternative currencies, disruptive models, the way in which the banks need to change. But in some ways it's always been a little bit frightening. And this year we're trying to make it much more engaging and looking at the opportunity by saying, well, here's the old business model of banking that was based around revenues built through customer relationships, through physical channels and relationships, and through a cost infrastructure built through a heritage of technology investments that's cemented the old way of doing things to a large extent. Are we breaking that apart? Do we need to fundamentally change? Do we need to have huge disruption and revolution of banking? Or can we just evolve to keep up with the needs of customers, the needs of the infrastructure that delivers products to customers? And the guys who joined us today are very much involved in nibbling away at some of those old ways of doing things and looking at the new ways. And so, Uday, I don't know if you want to add something.
I think that's exactly right. I think that the key point for us has been, as we've evolved the future of money over the last 3 or 4 years, what we've tried to do is we started with some abstract thinking about Bitcoin and virtual currencies, and where we've really got to this year is to give people a very practical toolkit to go back with, to think about how they can modify, how they can think about those business models and actually apply those sitting at home. And so there were some very practical thoughts around 4 or 5 key areas: customer, product, how you go out, how you integrate infrastructure, and probably worth handing over to Scott a little bit to talk about the product side of it, sorry, the customer side of it.
Yeah, tell us about these practical things that people could do.
So I think 2013 for the future of money is a key kind of step, because it's there's been a number of startups in this space over the last decade, and we're starting to get some pedigree and some credibility on the scoreboard. And it's now about saying, okay, what can we share with the broader banking community in terms of helping them on their journey as well? So the theme that I really focused on today was around what time can they spend with their customer? What can they learn from them? How can they draw innovation from their customer? Understand and empathize with their pain points, their feelings, their desires today, how they evaluate service providers. Why do they use Spotify or Facebook? Why do they use iTunes or Netflix? And how those service expectations translate to the world of money and money providers.
My focus was very much looking at it from an infrastructure standpoint. So we talk about the amount of innovation that's taking place with all the startups and everybody else coming around. So the big question is, what can a bank do? Well, the challenge that the banks have is that their infrastructure is very large and very complex, which makes change very difficult, particularly anything that impacts the core of the infrastructure. But over time, what's happened is many banks have merged, and so they now have multiple platforms. And those multiple platforms further increase the complexity. You layer on that regulation, which has to be taken care of, pretty much uses up all the spare capacity that banks have. And so what it leaves is very little ability to innovate. So the question is, what do banks do? They can either go try to go it alone way and do it the same way as they've done it before, which means that faster, more nimble newcomers will pretty much eat away at the revenue model around the edges and leave them with the most difficult and least lucrative parts. So the idea really what we were promoting and talking about is there an alternative model, which is more about partnerships, where you embrace some of the new concepts and create a best of breed solution. So the bank basically owns the customer relationship, owns the revenue model, and the overall customer experience. But assemble solutions from best of breed providers behind the scenes, so they're not doing everything themselves.
So is there a new, if you like, job description, a new department that a bank needs to start recruiting?
I think it's called the Chief Executive Officer. Basically, the decision like this can really be made at the top. It's like the car industry. If you think about it, if you look at a car, you buy a Toyota or a BMW, and your experience is that particular brand, and you think that's what you're buying. But the reality is most of these car companies don't manufacture anything. But they own the customer experience, they own the revenue model, they own the brand image. But most of the component parts are made by other people.
Okay.
Yeah, and part of what I was discussing on the panel was how with a system like Bitcoin that's come to be and emerged and is on a rapid adoption curve, you're seeing that these very customers are now being individually empowered to make their own choices and transact on their own terms, take back things like financial privacy into their own hands. It's a journey of consumer empowerment. And so how do you compete then for customer trust in an environment where they're not required to trust you anymore?
Yeah.
I think what you're seeing from these three guys is the deconstruction of banking, because through digitization, we've taken banking to pieces, at the front end with the customer, at the back end with the infrastructure, and at the core in terms of cash and digitizing cash. What that leads to is saying we need to reinvent not just the business model, but the organization of financial services, which is where Dave comes in, because how do you restructure your organization to handle the fast-moving change of digitization?
Okay.
And I guess, Dave, that's
So
where...
Dave, tell us a little bit about that. I'm the CEO of a bank. I call you up and I say, help me, because all these guys are going to come and steal my lunch. What do you tell me?
Well, what's going on in the world today is we have this digital revolution, we have the social network revolution, we have mobile technologies, and what that's happening is it's just accelerating everything. And meanwhile, our organizations are still designed in a hierarchical fashion, so we can't respond to change very well. When new situations come up at a company today, they're new situations, so they get delegated up the chain. And the farther up in the hierarchy you go, the more out of date the person is who's making the decisions. So the people who are on the front lines, who are most current with the current day situations, are delegating decisions up to people whose history, whose last time they were on the front line could have been 10, 15 years ago.
So the change that needs to happen then in a bank from a practical sense is what?
Well, in a practical sense, you need to give those people at the front line of the organization more power and authority to make decisions, because they're in the best position to make decisions. And they have to be able to make them very quickly. So imagine if you said something on Twitter and I have to ask my boss before I can respond to you. And maybe my boss is asleep. So imagine now, meanwhile, while you're waiting for me to respond to you on Twitter, my competitor is talking to you, and you're getting more and more angry and frustrated, and now you decide, as a gentleman did just about a week ago, decided that he was going to buy a promoted tweets because he was so upset with his airline losing his bags that he actually promoted his angry tweets. Because when the airline finally was able to respond, it was too late. So things can spiral out of control very quickly in this hyper-connected world we're in, and as an organization, you need to be able to respond rapidly, which means that the hierarchical chain of command is not going to function in that world.
Yeah, and we really, it's interesting, at Anthemis, we kind of live and die by what Dave's talking about, because when we put Anthemis together 4 years ago, we thought the way we really need to build this is a loose network of companies that can work with each other. So what binds them is the commonality of having us in as an investor and somebody who works with them. And for them to be within this trusted environment and working with each other creates a decentralized flat structure, which we think is the future and is the company of the 21st century. And as Dave talked about, part of this is making sure that at every level your people are as reactive as possible to very changing market conditions and are able to really go after that.
So are you, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, this is what's happening. Banks, financial institutions are not designed today to respond rapidly to competitive challenges from small startups. But yet, startups like the startups that Anthemis is founding and behind, and like Hank is talking about, are disruptive technologies. They're moving very, very fast. And for banks to be able to respond to this is quite difficult because
That's the point of Innotribe, though. I mean, the point of Innotribe is to create that responsiveness capability for the banking community.
But is it?
Well, to an extent, the guys in Innotribe describe themselves as the castle and the sandbox. The castle is Swift, that has to be secure, resilient, stable. The sandbox is Innotribe, so you can play with new things, try out new things. And last year, they created $120 million of new investment in startups to give them the flourishment to create new capabilities for the banking community. I see the same in banks. The banks are doing the same to say, we need to have people who fight the business as usual, who can create new businesses. If those new businesses flourish, let them cannibalize the bank, let them grow, let them become big businesses.
Hank.
And that's where, I mean, what we were talking about earlier, in order to be able to move fast, if they actually adopted the partnership model that we're talking about, like at Earthport we provide a single product, low value payments, cross-border, anybody can connect, deliver it anywhere. There's hundreds of similar services that a bank needs. So if they were assembling best of breed solutions, their ability to change and innovate faster would be much, much better, because if a better solution came around, you can replace it. You already know that it's functioning, as opposed to building another organization, chartering another project, starting and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work. So the new model, if they actually were able to assemble the best of breed solutions, would allow them to not only respond better to customer needs, but actually end up with better solution quicker.
Just one point, this is very important, because as Hank talks about and as we talked about, this is part of assembling the best business. So as Hank said, you can own the customer, you can own the customer experience, you don't have to own the different layers in the value chain. And so what we've been talking about for many years, and actually if you look at Moven or you look at Simple.com or any one of the other new age banks that we're starting to work with, what we do is we don't, for example, necessarily have the regulatory layer. We outsource that to somebody else. We don't necessarily have the risk layer. We outsource that to somebody else. So we're really taking best of breed components, who's got the best balance sheet, compliance and regulatory, taking the best of breed on the risk, taking the best of breed on infrastructure, like using Earthport for low value payments, and putting that all together in a package. For a consumer, it's seamless. It's like your Apple iPhone, which, by the way, Apple doesn't manufacture a single component in there. It's manufactured in China. They got component. They own the design and the user experience, and so that's what's important.
they hardly make any apps either.
I want to come back to the very interesting point that you made, which is about, this has to come from the senior leadership, from the CEO. And I think that's probably where the clash, the friction is coming, because take a lot of these CEOs, they are I guess, lifetime bankers in a way, and even just with the language. I mean, sometimes when you guys speak, I'm thinking, what are they saying? Do you know what I mean? So just the language, translating what you're trying to say to a CEO, and then how he can start mobilizing the bank, because at the moment you're having these, if I'm right in saying, you're having these conversations, Udayan, with the people who are already converted, preaching to the converted, whereas what you really want to be able to do is to have those conversations directly with the senior leadership of the bank.
But on that point, I think we're increasingly seeing the big banks talk to people like us and Earthport and others. They're coming in, they recognize that change is coming, they need to figure out how they best work through that change. And so different banks think about it different ways. We don't necessarily see a situation in 20 or 30 years where the incumbents disappear. What we do see is a period of incredibly rapid change, faster, and by the way, some of the incumbents will disappear. Certainly the smaller ones, the ones who don't embrace change quick enough. But there are banks around the world that are now seriously thinking about it. If you saw the Sibos newsletter this morning, you'll see on the front the Deutsche Bank App Store. So Deutsche Bank has embraced the App Store model. Credit Agricole has embraced the App Store. They're opening their infrastructure up to other people to innovate on top of it, and so that's starting to happen.
Within that, I mean, I'm talking to an awful lot of banks around how do we become a digital bank, and that's coming from the CEO. The CEO has grown up in the internet age. It's not an alien world to them. They're saying, well, we need to be a digital bank, but we still have the physical old bank. How do we become the digital bank? And you see quite a lot of them creating freedom fighters to fight business as usual, to actually create innovation, do new things. And I could go through a long list of banks, but there's a free book called Digital Bank that's come out from Sibos.
Free book.
So you can have the free book.
Where do we get that from?
Just send an email to Camilla at fsclub.co.uk.
Camilla,
Kamila, at fsclub.co.uk.
Perfect.
It's not an all or nothing, because it's not like the CEO has to decide to completely reinvent the bank. You can actually start
Try.
we are talking to many banks who are now embedding our capabilities in there, and it's one product. If it does well and it works, they can try it another product. If it doesn't, they can throw it out. So you can experiment a little bit.
Well, and also I think that there's a need for banks to also embrace a customer segment that is the innovative payments companies. Right now, there's a big struggle for the payments companies to even achieve simple banking, and just developing those partnerships and those relationships early with some of the more innovative startups, I think would go a long way to helping solve some of these problems, both for the startups and for the banks themselves in innovating.
Scott, you wanted to make a point.
I mean, one of the key trends across here is that these things are not new. They're not, it's not guesswork.
Yeah.
The customer base is already demanding this of their service providers. And this is why I like to compare the likes of Amazon and Spotify to a bank, because the framework in which they engage their customers is everything that we've just spoken about as a desirable state. They're already doing it today. So when you have a pure digital native who's, in their teens now, they've grown up in a world where they don't understand the world of analog, they don't understand the world of cassette tapes and record players and so forth. When they become the workforce of tomorrow, they will come to their service providers and evaluate those service providers as if you were Spotify, as if you're Amazon. And it's saying, banks, how could you prepare yourselves for that? And as Chris mentioned, there's a number of banks around the world. Where I'm from in Singapore, banks like Standard Chartered are taking calculated small risks of saying, okay, we're not going to risk the house, but we'll do this small thing called Breeze. And Breeze is saying that, okay, if we were to bring product to market that's more digitally friendly, this is a small experimentation we can have. Similarly, OCBC there is doing a thing called Frank. It's saying, okay, we'll listen to a different marketplace, we'll listen to a different customer voice to shape an offering that's more appealing to them. And I think it's about, how do we take calculated risks? Yes, there's going to be large transformation over the next decade, but what are the things they can do in the next 6 months, the next 12 months, the next 24 months? They can say we can start the journey. Because one of the hard things they still have to get over culturally is they are bankers, and they've been bankers for decades. They have to unlearn some of their history to relearn the future. Now they bring some valuable knowledge of how banking works, how it's regulated and so forth, but it's got to evolve into this idea of what does banking look like in the Web 2.0 world or the Bank 3.0 world.
I have to say, every CEO of a bank should wake up every morning and ask himself one question. What happens when Apple or Amazon become a bank? Right? And I think that's what should be scaring people, because we were talking earlier, actually, somebody said this and I found it fascinating. He's got 2 kids, they're 8 and 10, and what those kids do is they save up their money and they put it into their iTunes account, because they're making purchases. Their first purchase as a consumer is typically Angry Birds 3 or whatever it is. So their user experience as a child is actually, and he was from Coca-Cola, so he talked about older people, when they grew up, their first user experience of buying something was a Coca-Cola from a vending machine. Their first user experience as a child is actually using the iTunes store or buying something from Amazon. And so once Amazon and Apple start to really embrace banking, I think that's what people should be scared of, and how you actually react to that with some of the things that Scott's been talking about.
Great point. Thanks very much. Thanks to all of you. We've got to leave it there.